The smell of fresh-baked pies had always been enough to draw half the town to Clara's bakery. But on that morning, as the sun lit the maple leaves outside in gold and crimson, it drew something else. She stepped to the window, wiping her hands on her apron, and froze. There, sitting squarely on the sidewalk, was the largest brown bear she'd ever seen. It wasn't snarling or pawing at the door, just sitting, watching her, as though it was patiently waiting its turn. The morning had started like any other. Clara was up before dawn, rolling out dough on the wide wooden counter that had belonged to her father. The air was warm with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples, and the soft hum of the oven filled the quiet shop. Outside, the streets were still empty, save for a few drifting leaves and the faint hiss of wind down from the mountains. She'd just slid a tray of pecan pies into the oven when the faint crunch of footsteps on the sidewalk caught her attention. At this hour, it was usually Mr. Wilkins from the post office or young Danny delivering the morning paper. She wiped her hands on her apron, moved to the front, and looked out the glass door. Her breath caught. A massive brown bear sat on the pavement, its thick fur flecked with dew, eyes fixed on her through the glass. It wasn't moving toward the door, wasn't baring its teeth, just sitting there, its nose twitching as if catching every note of the warm, sugary air drifting from the bakery. Clara's first instinct was to back away slowly. She'd lived in the mountains long enough to know you didn't feed wild bears. But something about the way it sat, calm, patient, made her pause. She glanced down at the cooling rack beside her. There, in the middle, sat a small apple hand pie, one she'd made as an extra. Without really thinking it through, she slid open the small side window, the one she used to pass coffee cups to early customers. The bear lifted its head slightly at the sound. Clara took the pie, still warm, and placed it carefully on the wooden sill before closing the window again. The bear waited until she'd stepped back, then rose with a slow, deliberate motion. It moved to the sill, sniffed the pie, and, with surprising gentleness, took it in its jaws. A few seconds later, the pastry was gone. Clara expected it to leave then, but instead, the bear sat back down, licking its muzzle once, eyes still on her. She stood in the warm glow of the bakery, her heart hammering, and thought, well, what on earth have I just started? Clara spent the rest of that morning glancing toward the door more than toward her customers. She didn't mention the encounter to anyone, partly because she didn't want to cause alarm, partly because she didn't quite know how to explain it without sounding as though she'd lost her sense. By the time she locked up that evening, the bear was long gone. The sidewalk was empty, save for a scattering of crisp leaves in the gutter, and the street lamps were beginning to flicker on. She told herself it had probably just been passing through, drawn by the smell, and that would be the end of it. But the next morning, as she carried a tray of steaming blueberry pies to the cooling rack, there it was again. Same spot. Same stillness. Eyes fixed on her as though it had been waiting for her to notice. Clara froze for a moment, hands wrapped around the hot tray. She knew she shouldn't encourage it. Yet when she looked into those dark eyes, there was no hint of threat, just quiet expectation. She took a deep breath, set down the tray, and walked to the side window. This time, she'd planned ahead. On the sill sat a small, still-warm berry turnover, one she'd wrapped in parchment. She slid open the window, placed it down, and stepped back. The bear approached slowly, sniffed the turnover, then picked it up with that same gentle precision she'd seen yesterday. It sat on its haunches just beyond the window, eating in small, deliberate bites, leaving only a few crumbs scattered on the pavement. Clara stood inside, watching, her apron dusted with flour, the oven humming softly behind her. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. More curious. There was something about the quiet patience of the animal, the way it didn't press closer or paw at the door. When the bear finished, it lifted its head toward her, holding her gaze for a moment before turning and walking down the street toward the edge of town. Clara stayed at the window until it disappeared around the corner. She didn't know why, but her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. By the third morning, Clara no longer questioned whether the bear would come. She was already at the side window when she heard the now familiar crunch of heavy paws on the sidewalk. The sun had barely cleared the ridge, bathing the bakery in a soft golden light, and the air carried the sharp scent of cinnamon from the pecan pies cooling behind her. The bear appeared from the same direction as before, its breath curling in pale clouds. It stopped in front of the window, sitting just as it always did, like a customer waiting for service. Clara couldn't help but smile. She set a plate on the sill, today's offering, a slice of warm apple pie with a flaky crust dusted in sugar. The bear leaned in, sniffed, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Clara noticed how deliberate its movements were, as though it understood the need to be careful around the fragile plate. She wondered if it had been fed by people before or if this gentleness was simply part of its nature. As the bear ate, a few townsfolk walked past on the opposite side of the street. Most didn't even glance over, too busy with their errands. But Mrs. Carter, the librarian, caught sight of the scene and froze mid-step. Clara gave her a quick wave, and though Mrs. Carter's eyes widened, she didn't shout or run. She simply nodded slowly and went on her way. Clara suspected she wouldn't tell anyone. In a small town, some things were better left unspoken. When the plate was empty, the bear sat for a moment longer, as though lingering in the warm scent of the bakery. Then, without fuss, it turned and padded back toward the tree-lined road leading out of town. Clara took the plate inside, washing it with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It struck her that the bakery had been her father's dream, then hers. Now, in a way she never expected, it had become part of this bear's world too. By the end of that week, Clara had stopped pretending the extra pie was for anyone else. She woke earlier than usual, her hands moving through the motions of kneading, rolling, and filling with an ease born from decades of repetition, but now with a small, secret anticipation. Every morning, she baked one pie that wasn't listed on the chalkboard menu. It sat cooling on the far end of the counter, out of sight from customers, ready for the quiet visitor who came without fail. The bear never arrived at the same exact time, but Clara could always tell when it was near. Sometimes it was the faint shift in light outside the window, sometimes the soft scrape of claws on the sidewalk. She would glance up, and there it would be, framed against the backdrop of red and gold leaves drifting from the maples. That morning, she chose pumpkin pie, silky filling, a hint of nutmeg, and a golden crust. She slid the plate onto the sill, the warm scent curling into the cool air. The bear approached with the same calm grace as always, lowering its head to eat. Clara stayed close, her hands resting on the window frame. She noticed tiny details now, the lighter streaks of fur along its muzzle, the slow blink of its eyes between bites, the way it always sat just far enough back not to startle her. As it ate, a delivery truck rumbled past, the driver slowing for a moment to take in the sight. Clara braced herself for a horn or a shout, but the man only gave a small, almost respectful nod before moving on. When the bear finished, it licked its muzzle clean, then, for the first time, let out a deep, low chuff of sound. Not a growl, not a warning, but something that seemed conversational. Clara tilted her head, smiling faintly. "You're welcome," she said, her voice soft over the hum of the oven. The bear held her gaze for another heartbeat, then rose and walked back toward the trees. The plate stayed warm in her hands for a long time after she brought it in. The first snow of the season came suddenly, sweeping down from the mountains overnight. By morning, the streets were muffled under a clean white layer, the air sharp with cold. Clara stood at the bakery's front window with her coffee, watching her breath fog the glass. She didn't expect to see the bear today, not in weather like this. Still, she baked the extra pie. Habit now. This time, it was a rustic blackberry, the filling bubbling purple and sweet beneath a lattice crust. She set it on the cooling rack and tried to busy herself with preparing coffee orders for the handful of regulars brave enough to venture out. The morning stretched on. The pie cooled completely. Clara told herself she'd take it home if the bear didn't come by closing. She was wiping down the counter when she caught the faintest movement beyond the window, a dark shape emerging through the curtain of falling snow. Her heart jumped. The bear moved more slowly today, snowflakes clinging to its thick fur, its breath steaming in the cold air. It padded across the empty street and settled into its usual spot outside the side window. Clara didn't make it wait. She carried the pie to the sill, setting the plate down with both hands. The bear leaned forward, sniffed once, and began eating with that same deliberate care. Snow gathered on its back as it ate, the white dusting stark against the deep brown of its coat. For the first time, Clara opened the window a little wider, letting the smell of pastry and berries drift out in a warm cloud. The bear paused mid-bite, its eyes lifting to meet hers. Something in that steady gaze made the cold outside feel very far away. When it finished, the bear stayed for a moment, simply sitting in the snow, as if reluctant to leave. Clara didn't speak, but she found herself smiling as the wind tossed a few stray flakes into the bakery's warm air. Then, with a slow turn, the bear walked back into the white, its massive form fading into the snowfall until it was gone. Clara left the window open a moment longer, letting the winter air mingle with the scent of pie. The snow lingered for days, though the storm had passed. The roads were plowed, but the air stayed sharp enough to sting Clara's cheeks each time she stepped outside. Business slowed, the bakery felt quieter than usual, the bell over the door ringing only a handful of times a day. Still, Clara kept up her routine. Every morning, she prepared an extra pie without hesitation, almost without thinking, and placed it near the side window to cool. That Thursday morning, she decided on maple pecan. The warm, nutty scent filled the shop, blending with the faint smokiness of wood stoves from nearby homes. By mid-morning, she caught the now familiar shape moving through the snow beyond the town's edge. The bear arrived with less urgency than she'd expected, as though it knew its place here now. Clara slid open the window, setting the plate on the sill. But this time, the bear didn't go straight for the pie. Instead, it stood there for a moment, just looking at her. She noticed how its ears tilted slightly forward, its breath puffing into the cold air between them. Then, slowly, it stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual grains of snow clinging to its whiskers. Clara froze, her hand resting on the frame. The bear lowered its head until its nose was level with the windowsill but didn't touch the plate. It looked at her one more time before beginning to eat. She felt something shift in that moment, as if the pie was only part of the reason it came. This was more than hunger. It was a kind of recognition, an acknowledgement that the warm space on the other side of the glass belonged to someone who understood its quiet approach. When it finished, the bear lingered again, the snow in its fur beginning to melt in tiny droplets. It gave a slow blink, then turned and walked away, its tracks leading into the trees. Clara watched until it was gone, then brought the empty plate inside. The pie had been the gift, yes, but the pause before eating, the way it had looked at her, that felt like something else entirely. It was a Saturday morning when the quiet rhythm between Clara and the bear was interrupted. The streets were busier than usual, weekend shoppers, children playing in the snowbanks, the sound of laughter carrying through the crisp air. Clara wasn't expecting the bear to come on a day like this. But as she pulled a steaming cherry pie from the oven, she caught sight of movement outside the side window. There it was, the bear, as calm as ever, padding across the snowy street toward the bakery. Its paws left deep, clean impressions in the white, each step slow and certain. Clara hesitated. With more eyes around, she wasn't sure how this would go. She didn't want to draw attention, but she couldn't bring herself to ignore it either. She cut a generous slice, set it on the familiar white plate, and opened the window. The bear approached, lowering its head toward the pie. That's when Clara heard the voice behind her. "Well, I'll be." She turned to see Tom Reddick, the retired mail carrier, standing in the doorway with a paper bag of rolls he'd just bought. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but something closer to disbelief. Is that bear eating pie?" he asked, stepping closer. Clara gave a small, warning look. "Quiet, Tom. He's gentle." Tom stood still, watching as the bear carefully ate the slice, pausing between bites to glance toward Clara. "I've walked this route for 30 years, Tom murmured, almost to himself. "Never seen anything like this." The bear finished, licking a single crumb from the plate before stepping back. For a moment, it looked between Clara and Tom. Then, with no sign of alarm, it turned and walked toward the tree line. Tom finally exhaled. "You've got yourself a customer there, Clara." She smiled faintly, closing the window. "I suppose I do." From that day on, she suspected the story would drift quietly through town, not shouted, but shared in low, knowing voices. And she didn't mind. Some things were too rare to hide completely. By late February, the snow began to soften under the first hints of spring. Icicles dripped steadily from the eaves of the bakery, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth beneath the melting snow. Clara noticed the bear's visits becoming less frequent, its appearances spaced farther apart. One morning, she found herself standing by the window long after opening, scanning the street out of habit. The white plate she'd set on the sill held a slice of peach pie, its golden filling glistening in the light. Hours passed. Customers came and went. The plate stayed untouched. It wasn't until the next week that she saw him again, not in the morning, but late in the afternoon when the shadows had begun to stretch across the street. The bear appeared from the direction of the river, fur damp, as though it had waded through the melting banks. It walked slower than usual, but its eyes were the same, steady, watchful. Clara didn't wait. She brought the plate to the window, setting down a fresh slice of apple crumble she'd kept warm in the oven. Steam curled up into the cool air. The bear sniffed once before eating, but this time, when it finished, it didn't turn to leave. Instead, it stayed, standing just outside the open window. Clara noticed the tiniest tilt of its head, the way it seemed to listen to the quiet clatter inside the bakery. She found herself talking, not much, just the way she might to a friend stopping by. She told it the town had been busy with spring festival plans, that the snow might be gone sooner this year. The bear blinked slowly, as if the sound of her voice was enough. When it finally stepped away, the sunlight caught the melting droplets in its fur, turning them to tiny sparks. Clara knew the seasons would keep pulling it farther into the wild, but she had a feeling it would always find its way back. By mid-April, the town had shed its winter skin. The maples outside the bakery wore soft green leaves, and the air was alive with birdsong. Clara found herself propping the bakery's front door open in the afternoons to let in the fresh breeze, the scent of pies mingling with lilacs from the flower shop down the street. The bear had not come in nearly 3 weeks. Clara told herself it was natural, that with the forest thawing and streams running full, there was more than enough food in the wild. Still, each morning, she set aside a slice of whatever she'd baked, placing it on the side counter just in case. It was on a particularly warm afternoon that she heard the familiar rhythm of heavy steps. She looked up from the register, and there he was, not just alone, but with a smaller bear at his side. The cub was young, its fur lighter, moving with the hesitant steps of something new to the wider world. Clara's breath caught. She moved quietly to the side window, setting down a plate with 2 slices of fresh strawberry rhubarb pie. The larger bear approached first, eating with the same deliberate care as always. The cub hung back, sniffing the air before inching forward to take a bite from the second slice. It was clumsy, crumbs scattering onto the sill, but Clara couldn't help but smile. She stayed still, letting them eat in peace. Townsfolk passing on the far side of the street slowed, watching the scene but saying nothing, perhaps understanding, without words, that this was something rare. When they finished, the larger bear lifted its head, meeting Clara's eyes with a long, steady gaze. The cub mimicked the gesture, though with a curious tilt of its head. Then, as quietly as they'd come, the two turned back toward the green edge of the forest. Clara stood at the window long after they'd gone, the scent of strawberries and sugar still in the air. It wasn't just her customer anymore, it was a part of a story that was still unfolding. The following weeks settled into a gentle rhythm of warmer days, open windows, and the hum of conversation spilling from the bakery. Clara's regular customers came and went, unaware, or perhaps deliberately choosing not to mention how often her gaze drifted to the side window. The bear's visits were no longer daily, but when they came, they felt even more special. Sometimes the cub was with him, growing bolder each time, its movements more assured. Other days he came alone, sitting in that same patient way, the sound of his breathing mixing with the faint clink of plates and the scent of sugar in the air. One evening, just before closing, Clara sat by the open window with a cup of tea. The streets were quiet, the last of the day's light sinking behind the hills. She hadn't expected company, but she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps before she saw him. The bear emerged from the shadows, the air around him carrying the faint smell of pine and earth. This time, Clara hadn't baked an extra pie. Instead, she reached behind her for a small plate of leftover biscuits, placing them gently on the sill. The bear stepped forward, ate in silence, and then, instead of leaving, simply remained there. They sat together, separated by the wooden frame of the window, the evening breeze carrying the smell of spring blossoms from down the street. For a long while, neither moved. The bear blinked slowly, and Clara found herself speaking in a quiet voice, as if telling a story to an old friend. She told him about her father, about the bakery's early days, about the way the town had changed over the years. He didn't understand the words, but something in his stillness felt like listening. When the bear finally turned to go, Clara felt no sadness, only a deep, steady warmth. She knew he would return when he chose, in his own time, in his own way. And whether it was weeks or months, she would be here, apron dusted with flour, oven warm, ready to greet him. She closed the window gently, the fading light pooling across the counter. Outside, the bear disappeared into the green shadows of the trees, as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind the scent of the forest and the memory of shared silence.